Cisco ISE 2.3 Easy Connect. As many of you know, ISE is a core component within Cisco security architecture. It shares contextual data with multiple different products, including third-party, as well as provides things like rapid threat containment, and I'll talk about those later. In this video, we're going to show you how to set up passive identity and Easy Connect. So with active identity, 802.1x is used, and obviously got to modify the supplicant on each endpoint. There's a lot more configuration and complexity, but it's in line, it's in the path, and therefore just a little more effort to put in play. With passive identity, we have the ability to provide 802.1x like capabilities, very limited access when you first connect, and then you authenticate with Active Directory, and then we give you full access. And again, you get IP to user mappings, and that's used, or the capability around getting that information around things like WMI, AD agent, syslog, etc. So if you look at the flow, and this is from back in 2.1, but if you look at the flow, the user gets limited access, right? So very limited access to DHCP, DNS, NTP, Active Directory. And then from there, the user will authenticate. Again, ISE does not play a role in this. Obviously they get authenticated. ISE retrieves that user ID and user's AD membership, and then from unknown to limited access, we move into employees full access. Change of authorization takes place where we add additional layers of security to the port and give the user access. So Cisco Easy Connect is kind of a middle ground between MAC authentication bypass and 802.1x. So here we go. First and foremost, I want to apologize. I didn't realize that the video was shrunk down, but I went through it. Everything is there that you need to see, and I fix it in the very last portions of the video, but I didn't want to go back and redo everything. So here we go. We're going to go to passive identity setup, and this is kind of a little more wizard driven. So the first thing that we need to do is enable passive ID. And all I had to do is check that little box, move over, enable passive identity service, save this, and that portion is complete. So now that I have that complete, I'll go back to the passive ID setup, and I'll continue through the wizard. So here I'm going to give a name for the instance or Active Directory instance that I'm tying this to. I'll put in the Active Directory domain, the the administrator, and password. Obviously, you can use a minimized account, and we've got, or Cisco's got, obviously, all the details around how to do that. In my case, I'm just showing you how to get this up and running fairly quickly, and using the administrator account. Here, what we're going to do is collect or select the Active Directory groups that we're interested in. In my case, I'm going to do domain admins, I'm going to do HR, IT, and I think sales, right? So that's done. We'll hit next here. And at this point, if you want, you could add additional AD servers. I only have one in my lab environment, so we're good. So that's up and running. So let's, and you can see by default we're using WMI, but there's a couple of other agents. Again, I'm using WMI in this scenario because it doesn't require any additional agents or elements to be configured. So let's go back to administration, and we're going to go to external identities, and here's where we're going to see that Active Directory external identity that we just configured. And from here, we can see that it's operational. If we needed to join, we can do that from here. We'll go to passive identity, and we can see that looks good. And again, we can see that we're using WMI. We can see the groups that we selected, right? So that's good. So let's go back to passive identity, and let's just ensure that that everything is working. And I know in previous versions, I believe there's a lot more work and effort involved here, and Cisco's done a great job of simplifying this. So let's add a password here, and then we'll hit configure. Successfully configured. Okay, great. And then we'll just do a quick test. And we can see everything looks good. Perfect. We'll save that out. And we'll continue moving along here. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create a couple of DACLs and a downloadable access control lists, and then some authorization profiles. So here, the very first one's going to be limited access. So this is when a user initially plugs in, they're going to have access to Active Directory. They're going to have access to ISE, things like NTP, DNS, DHCP, etc. In my case, the domain controller is also DHCP, DNS, etc. You can obviously be a lot more granular in the access control lists, and with Active Directory, there's a ton of ports that you'll have to accommodate for, but it is certainly doable. From here, what we'll do is we're going to create a specific downloadable ACL for each of the users. In my case, it's going to be permit IP any for each one of these. All I'm concerned about showing here is that the policy was pushed when someone logs in and they got the right ACL. But you could be granular. You can say HR, for example, can only get to HR systems, right? And sales has access to Salesforce, right? For example, so you certainly can be granular. Again, I'm just doing it to showcase how easy it is to get set up, and then obviously you would take that initial setup and modify it to accommodate your environment and needs. And the check DACL is a nice feature that has been added for some time now, but allows you to check the syntax of the ACL to ensure that it's actually going to work on the device when you push it. So now we've got a couple of ACLs, so that's good. So now we'll create a couple of authorization profiles. And these are going to be applied later on to our authorization policy, but we'll get there in a moment. So the limited access, we're going to enable passive identity tracking, and we'll enable that for this particular authorization profile. We'll also do the downloadable access control list. We're going to grab that limited ACL that we just created. That allows us access to ISE, and in our case, DHCP, DNS, and Active Directory. We'll save that out, and we're going to go through this and also do the same for HR, IT, domain admins, etc. Again, we'll select the appropriate DACL. We do not need passive identity tracking based on Easy Connect 2.1 installation recommendation guide that I followed. So we only need to enable it on the initial instance. So again, you can't see, but I'm scrolling down and I'm selecting save. This is where that video kind of dropped down, or I didn't have it aligned properly, but anyways. Okay, so we'll finish up here. Sales DACL, save that. Perfect. So now we've got our authorization profiles. Now we'll come into the policy set, and you'll see that this is certainly changed from previous versions, especially if you've been in the older 1.x version. So, some of this is drag and drop, which is kind of neat. So what we want to do here is grab wired MAB and save it out. Later on, I actually include the devices as well as part of this policy set, just because I'm going to have multiple policy sets here and I want to turn them on and off as needed. And so I added an additional layer of granularity. So for now, we've got Easy Connect, we've got wired MAB, right? MAC authentication bypass. And now we're going to start building out our rules. So here we go. We're going to select wired MAB. And again, you can't see, but I'm selecting save. And then from here, we're going to do internal endpoints. So this is the initial authentication portion, right? We are using MAB in this case, because remember, ISE isn't actually doing or is not doing active authentication like 802.1x. It's actually providing MAB authentication, but it's using passive identity to get the user ID or IP to user mapping. Okay, so we've got our authentication policy. Our default is deny access, so that looks good. Now we move to the authorization side. So we're going to create a couple. Again, apologize for the video here. By going back and deleting everything and starting over, obviously, was a little bit more work. And I still think that you certainly see everything, so you're not missing anything. So the first one we got here is domain admins. And so what we're going to do is go to passive identity groups and grab and associate domain admins. So then you can see there's tons of attributes that you could leverage here to scrutinize the traffic. So here we go. Drop down that box. And you can see our group here. Perfect. Okay, and we'll save it. And we're going to continue to build this out, right? So the only difference is between each one is, or sorry, let me step back. First, we're going to apply the authorization profile that we created. In this case, it's going to be IT for that one. And you can see here, I've went ahead and created the other ones, right? So again, you define what it is, the rule name, you give a condition, and then you assign a authorization profile that has in our case, the downloadable access control list. The last one, though, is, and this should say Easy Connect, and I fix it later, but it really doesn't matter. It's wired MAB, and then the policy that's applied to that one will be the limited access authorization profile. All right, so that's good. We've got that going so far. But let's very quickly come in here and add the network access device, the NAD, that we're going to be using. So again, this is really from the scratch, right? There's nothing pre-configured other than ISE was IP address set up and ready to be configured. There was no previous build up before I did this. This is from start to finish. You can have it up and running in I think it's 21 minutes. And that's with testing. So here I'm adding some groups. So the reason why I'm adding groups here is so I can use these as conditions in some of the policy sets. So I can say if you're coming from a Cisco switch, then use this policy set, as well as some other criteria. So here we're going through and adding the device itself. So in my case, it's a 3560. We're going to give it an IP address, obviously, that the device is assigned. And then here we can select things like location. You can see there's some IPsec stuff as well as device type. And here we're going to select the switch itself. And then we're going to enable radius. So we're going to add a pre-shared key, right? Or a shared secret between the two, right? And that's it. The COA port is default for Cisco device because this is the profile was a Cisco device, so that's standard across that platform. And that's it from a NAD configuration perspective. The next step in this is to apply the configuration to the switch. So I'm not going to walk through each one of these, but essentially I created a AAA group, which happens to be the Radius, the ISE server that we have been configuring. And there's a couple of specific configurations, but I don't have to go and do the full .1x configuration. All I have to do is enable MAB and get that configured on the ports that I am interested in providing this function. So that's the gist of it. You can see, the Radius server at the bottom there. You can see I'm using 1812 and 1813. Radius server, the vendor specific attributes, right? We're using and sending those for accounting and authentication. And you can see my server key, which is the same as the server key that I used for the NAD configuration within ISE itself. So I'll quickly log in here and then I'll just apply that configuration. And that's done. And so let's go through some testing. So we can already see that some obviously I did some quick testing before finalizing here, but you can see 20 minutes, or we're 17 minutes now. We've got a full configuration built. We've got the ability to limit the access to the individual, and then once they authenticate to Active Directory, we can then push a new downloadable access control list and give them restricted or full access to the environment. But at least the asset starts, and when I say asset, I'm talking about everything that makes up the asset, including the user, starts off with limited access. So we've logged in and we can see the ACL applied is the sales ACL. So it would have went into limited access at first, and then once it got the information from Active Directory, which is fairly quick as you can see, it would provide that ACL and do that change of authorization. Now, you saw very quickly that I grabbed that ACL, and if I did show access lists without specifying the access list, I wouldn't have seen anything. So in order to see that user based ACL, you're going to have to actually grab the name and do a show access list and then the name itself. In my case, I've got this. It's an interesting configuration because these are VMs that have dedicated NICs assigned to them and then tied into those ports that I configured on the 3560, and then that goes back into the ESX box, which talks to ISE and then authorizes those ports. So you can see the IP address is correct. It aligns with what we saw in the logging as far as ISE is concerned. And here we're going to jump to another box. We're going to log in as a different user. And what we should see is obviously the HR user is highlighted here, and they end up getting the right access list. So you can see that that looks good. HR, we see the port is 10. We see the authorization profile is policy. Authorization policy is PID underscore HR. We can see the ACL here is referencing the HR ACL, and from here we can see the contents of that ACL. So if we go over to passive identity, you can see the work center is kind of a collection of items that that simplify deployment and monitoring, troubleshooting, etc. So here, real quick, we can see there's a couple of things that we could do. You could do a packet capture, right, and analyze that. And then we've got a bunch of reports that you can quickly generate to see what might be happening. Here you can see that we're looking at, the current users that are logged in. We can see it's MAB and passive ID is the auth method. We can see the users that we've just logged in with. We can see the endpoint ID, which is the MAC address of that asset. If we click on some of the things within the report itself, we pivot to another screen with a little more deeper insight into that specific parameter. When we come back to the logging, so we can come in and have a look at actually what happened during the authentication process. So we can see what authentication policy was hit, what our authorization policy was hit. We see, a lot of the details in regards to, the asset itself as a whole, what ACLs may have been applied, etc. Right? So if somebody from the user community calls and says, "Hey, I can't get access," you can very quickly come in and have a look at this, and it provides deep insight into maybe where that failure took place. There's other tools as well, but anyways, that's the gist of it. All right, thanks.